Hello, and welcome to another edition of iDS Talks. Specifically, welcome to D3, Delightfully Digestible Data, version 6. My name is Jonathan Sachs, Chief Revenue Officer at iDS, and I'm joined by Tim LaTulip, one of our directors out of iDS's London office, and I'd even call him a friend. As I said, we're here to talk about version 6 of D3, the email that Tim sends to various people. If you don't currently receive that email, he'd be happy to add you to it. You just need to reach out to him either from our website, idsinc.com, or you can find him on LinkedIn. Unlike other versions of Delightfully Digestible Data, version 6 focuses on only one topic, and that topic was the UK government's COVID-19 inquiry as it relates to Boris Johnson's communications.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jonathan. Looking forward to getting into it a bit.
All right, so I love this. I get to play the role of the ignorant American. So I think I might know what this story is about, but let's start with the backstory. COVID-19, things were happening over in Europe, in Great Britain. Things were happening here in the U.S. Boris Johnson at the time, Prime Minister. What's the backstory?
Yeah, I'll be pretty brief with that. I think it helps set the stage for people, but it's really a conversation about data and how what the sort of interplay is between these issues and those that our listeners might face with their internal investigations, regulatory inquiries, or litigation-based kind of challenges. But yeah, I mean, the world doesn't need much of a lesson in terms of what happened in 2020. The government sort of in domino fashion started locking down and shutting down. The UK were one of the latest or last in Europe. I mean, we might have even been after the United States, if I can't remember actually, but it's sort of irrelevant. But what's happened is our government here has launched an inquest or an inquiry into sort of how it was handled. The last time they did something this large would have been probably the Chilco report, which was kind of looking at Tony Blair's invasion of Iraq and that sort of thing. Which the facts show what they show. But that soaked up a lot of time and energy and money. This is following a similar process. I mean, I think there'll be some reports that come out. Hopefully it doesn't take 15 years like the other one did. But this is really looking into key decisions that the top of the food chain made during the initial lockdown period. So I think January 2020 to Feb 2021 or so. So you're looking about a baker's dozen there in terms of months. Primarily focusing on Boris Johnson's correspondence and communications. Whether they're looking at other ministers, I can't speak to that. I'm not super glued into the inquiry. But this is fairly standard for the UK government. When something major happens, they kind of turn the magnifying glass back on themselves and start having to dig into to evidence.
Okay, and so you talked about his communications, and so what I'd like to focus on here, because in part it was the focus of your D3, is communications through WhatsApp and therefore WhatsApp data, correct?
That's right. Correct.
Okay. So let me ask this question. What happens to WhatsApp data? And let's a question before that. The WhatsApp app is on my device. Where do my WhatsApp communications where do the communications sit? On my device or in the cloud? And what happens to that data?
Yeah, so this is a fun question, and it's a good place to start. I think this will help dispel and demystify it for some of the listeners and yourself potentially, Jonathan, because I think it's a bit of a confusing framework, how some of these applications work, WhatsApp in particular. So to start, the data actually don't live, up in the ether. They don't live. Meta, WhatsApp, the entity, any of their subsidiaries, they don't hold those messages somewhere. Like SMS text on your phone, those pass through a carrier. And unless you've got some kind of compliance agreement or some kind of search order type agreement in place, those aren't being captured either. What's happening here with WhatsApps is that they live on the device. So if Jonathan texts Dominic Tucker, those messages live on both of their handsets, on their devices. The other place they could live would be in sort of cloud backups, respectively. If they're using Android or iPhones, they would be in Google backups or in iCloud backups. So you'd have a derivative kind of one-to-one copy of those in their respective kind of locked cloud accounts. But there's no sort of middle point for these messages, and they exclusively live on the mobile phone that they're registered to.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah. And I appreciate the nuance of this, because it seems to depend on what your communications app is that you're using. And then as you've just said, it can depend on what kind of settings the user has, because you mentioned it could be in iCloud, unless I'm not saving things to iCloud.
That's right.
Right. And so that's interesting. Now, in the case of Boris Johnson and the quest for his communications, what was being claimed with respect to his WhatsApp communications, at least initially?
Yeah, sure. So there was the controversy, or the row about it that got picked up in the papers. I mean, some of that might have made its way out of the UK because he's such a high profile figure, but it certainly saturated the papers here. The inquiry had asked for certain documents and evidence, which they probably got fairly promptly and without much resistance. But the WhatsApp point is an inflection point for everyone, because in all manner of electronic investigation, it's where the authorities and those after potentially relevant data are looking. WhatsApp is insanely popular in Europe and in the UK, just all of Europe. I know it's used quite a bit in the US as well, but it's like the main way to communicate in this part of the world. It's platform agnostic. Anyone can use it. If you're using someone's got a Sony phone, someone's got an iPhone. It doesn't matter. Everyone can be in the same chat. So they were looking for those key messages because they knew well that ministers were using WhatsApp for official dealings, which is a whole nother, can of worms, and probably a conversation for someone like Jacques in a compliance centric conversation. But it's a bit nutty to me, actually, that persists to this day. There are definitely better ways you can still use WhatsApp, but there's better ways to kind of monitor it and make sure it's being captured for official purposes. But they knew ministers were communicating over WhatsApp. And so that was kind of a focus. People tend to be more candid with these kinds of apps. They feel familiar. They text their friends and their brothers and mothers on these things. So there's quite a bit of comfort with them. So some of the controversy around this had to do with the older of two phones that I understand Mr. Johnson had, one of which covered a period, the relevant period up until I think May of 2021 or something like that, whatever the cutoff period was. He had an older phone for which he could not produce the home screen PIN code. So if you take your iPhone and you tap the home button, if you have one, or you swipe up, or whatever, everyone's very familiar with this. You have to enter in a minimum of 4-digit PIN to unlock the phone. He was claiming he couldn't remember with confidence whatever this PIN number was. So this was the initial issue. They couldn't get into the phone to easily access the messages. Now I'll pause there because I'm sure you may or may not have a couple of questions on that.
Yeah. So I do like to watch TV and movies. And I feel like it's the classic situation of I forgot my passcode, because, well, let me start here. I'm sure we've all gone through I've entered the passcode. You entered it wrong the first time. You get that ominous warning, 4 more attempts until it locks.
Mm-hmm.
Then you see in these movies and these TV shows, they've got somebody's phone. They need to try to figure out the passcode. They need to do it before it locks, or so I finished watching the last season of Billions. I don't know if you watch it at all. Tim, but
I did.
so there's a scene where there are 10 devices with Bitcoin on them, and you get 10 chances to enter the passcode. And if you don't do it, then basically whatever Bitcoin is on there is gone forever. And it could be millions of dollars. And so you get to, 9 bad entries and you've got one left. Do you roll the dice or not? All right. So tangent. Sorry for everyone. 1 cup of coffee. Remember, he's afternoon, I'm morning. Okay. Boris Johnson says, I don't remember the passcode to my phone. Okay. Not a big deal. Can't you crack it? Aren't there companies out there that have software that can help crack the passcode?
Good question. And the answer is yes, to an extent. It's older versions of phones are far more susceptible to this kind of exploitation or attack. Given the time frame, I mean, he'd be using at least an iPhone 10, if not an 11 or something like that. And anything in that range and beyond up to this, 14 Pro or whatever is next to me are not susceptible to that kind of attack. At least not with standard kind of commercial forensic techniques. I mean, they perhaps could have gone a more sophisticated route with government resources to do that, but I'm going to say no. I mean, the short answer is that's doable on certain older phones, but it's relegated to the fiction of cinema and television to some extent.
Okay, so can't remember his passcode. I think you've basically already told us that recovery of that data is either going to require getting into that phone or perhaps getting access to Google or Apple's cloud-based storage, right?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
So what happens now? So he says, I don't remember my passcode with confidence.
Yeah. So what's happening at that probably point in the timeline is that people are scrambling. People like us, people like me, people on the forensic team like me, everyone who has this sort of background is on this side of the inquiry are saying, well, what the heck do we do now? Where else can we find this stuff? And this is how we kind of think about this in our engagements. And, if somebody says Jonathan's a key custodian, but, his phone's in the North Sea, he doesn't remember the password for it anyway, even if we fish it out with a 10-foot pole, that sort of thing does come up from time to time. And you have to start thinking about alternative sources for that data. And we kind of discussed it a little bit earlier, but where WhatsApp are stored are fairly limited. They're on your phone as the sender, but where else could they be? They could be on some of the recipients' phones. And so I'd sort of talked about this in my unpacking of it a little bit. But if Prime Minister's messaging health minister or somebody like that, well, then you could get a fairly robust, perhaps copy of those correspondence and those WhatsApp chats from the other party's phone. But then you start running into issues, which I won't cover here, of course, but very lightly they have to do with their data protection, their privacy, their contents having other sensitive communications with other ministers. You start to spiral out of control in terms of the scope and who gets sucked into the black hole of this thing. So without that, you're left to looking at those cloud sources that we talked about and you just mentioned. And there's actually little to no clarity in the public record whether he had cloud backups turned on. I've actually not seen any direct indication of that. In fact, I have mine turned off. Sometimes I switch it on and off for kind of testing just to see what sorts of things have changed. It's probably a good practice generally for most people, but I'm just sort of a data control freak, not a control freak in general. But I tend to flick off backups to different locations that are outside of my purview slightly. So WhatsApp as an application will actually remind users pretty incessantly to flick on backups to the cloud. If your app ever updates, you might notice it. They call it chat history. I think they use a different verbiage, but you kind of have to move your thumb up a little bit, kind of move out of your lazy routine and hit off or no thank you kind of thing. So policies on the phone or his team had that switched off perhaps. So let's assume he didn't have that enabled and that wasn't an option. what do you do? Well, in this case, they miraculously found the PIN code for the phone. I don't think it's much of a miracle. I think it was just a bureaucratic and administrative kind of slowdown. They probably found it on some old email or some, aid of somebody in the IT
No,
team
it's
wrote it on a
probably
notepad or
it's a post-it stuck underneath the keyboard.
it's probably
No,
something
I'm
like
not saying that's what it was for our listeners. I'm not. It was a joke. Joke.
yeah,
Don't know
yeah.
where it was. So Tim, really, it seems to me that the message from all of this is if somebody is involved in a situation where messaging data could be important, there needs to be considerations into the apps that were used, the devices that were used, and the importance of being curious and asking questions about where associated messages could be stored. Was it in the traditional places that we've talked about here? Was it other locations? But going into a matter and not thinking about messaging apps, devices used for that messaging and storage would be a critical miss.
Mm. Yeah, I almost, as you say this, I'm almost thinking our team should create some kind of printable or PDF infographic of the sort of likelihood of message retention and acquisition over a timeline. So is it are relevant messages from 5 years ago? Now you can't see me. I'm sort of shaking my head. That's starting to get fairly difficult.
Right.
Just the rapid pace at which people upgrade phones. They change mobile numbers. I talked about this a little bit in the D3 blast, but WhatsApp and a couple of other applications are tied to mobile phone numbers specifically. They're not tied to Jonathan Sachs at iDS. They're not tied to your Gmail account. They're not tied to anything but your mobile carrier's subscribed phone number. And if you change that, you can be in a world of hurt trying to acquire those, verify them from a cloud backup, that sort of thing. It gets very, very difficult. So people just, one of the takeaways is just to have awareness of this kind of thing, that they are dynamic, that they are nuanced, that, just because somebody says they remember those conversations happening doesn't mean we're going to magically, hoover them up from a single device. It might require quite a bit of head banging against the wall, trying 4 or 5 different things. Dom and I here in the London office worked on a case a couple months ago now. All the months have been flying. I think it was in the winter. And I think we did try 7 or 8 different sophisticated methods to get WhatsApp data from an Android phone in particular. It was absolutely brutal. But we got to the very last method we could possibly construct, and it was successful. But that took probably the better part of a week and a half. So people have to lay down some expectations as well.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I'll be very curious to see what the press does with any findings that come out. But certainly you've got me thinking about WhatsApp. Maybe I should start using it more. I think I have maybe 3 WhatsApp numbers, yours, Dan Ruprecht's, and my black cab driver for when I make my way over to London. So
we have a chat that you're not in, if that makes you feel better, Jonathan.
Yeah. Does not, but at least I don't have to worry about remembering my PIN code or whether or not I'm backing up that WhatsApp somewhere else. So anyway, I want to thank Tim for joining us today, as well as our regular subscribers and those that may be first-time listeners. If you'd like to learn more about iDS or want to subscribe to our iDS Talks podcast, you can visit idsinc.com or wherever you normally get your podcasts from. As I mentioned, if you'd like to start getting Tim's D3 email newsletter, just reach out to him. He'd be happy to add you. Thank you again for joining us. I look forward to talking more about data with you on our next edition of iDS Talks.
Thank you.